One of the most hotly debated topics in psychology is intelligence. In 1904, French government commissioned the first ever intelligence test. Alfred Binet was the psychologist, collected a very large number of data and proposed something that we call Intelligence Quotient, or IQ for short. IQ for Alfred Binet was based on the academic performance of children. For example, an average 9-year-old, according to Binet, should be able to perform certain tasks in school. And if they were performing at that level, they would have the mental age of 9. And Binet concluded that if a child was performing at an average age of 8, whereas their actual age was 9, so their IQ would be the mental age divided by their physical age times 100. Why was the number 100 used? So that they could use it as a quotient which was commonly understood. So I'll give you an example. A child is able to do the tasks that an average 9-year-old can do. The child's physical age is 9. According to Binet, the child's mental age would be 9. You divide 9 by 9, you get 1. And when you multiply 1 by 100, the child IQ is considered 100, which is supposed to be the average IQ. Let's take another child who has a mental age of 8, but the physical age is 16. Now you divide 8 by 16 and you multiply that with 100, you get an IQ of 50. That child would be considered extremely mentally retarded by Binet. You reverse that, a child performs at the level of a 16-year-old, whereas their age is 8. Now, in this situation, you would have a nearly impossible IQ of 200, which would help declare that child as a genius. Now, this seemed to be a very, very convenient tool, and the same principle was applied by psychologists from Stanford University, and the new test was called Stanford-Binet test of intelligence. Again, it was based on academic performance, which is children's performance in school, and this formula was widely recognized as the gold standard in intelligence testing. Now, intelligence, as I said, is a very hotly debated topic. And the reason for that is that academic performance is not and cannot be the entirety of human intelligence. What about children who never go to school? We have seen people perform all kinds of tasks without ever having been schooled. What about children who don't go to good schools? What about children who go to very, very good schools? What about children's social environment? What about children's emotional life? It was also argued that IQ was genetically inherited. Now, this again caused ripples among psychologists. Those favoring a more genetic idea of this general intelligence divided people into groups of what we call severely mentally retarded, below average intelligence, above average intelligence, significantly above average intelligence, and genius. These were the categories that came out of those intelligence tests. Many psychologists who were studying this phenomenon came up with strange findings. For instance, they found that white children, on average, performed better at IQ tests than black children. They supported the racist idea that white people were intellectually superior to black people. They found similar results when testing boys against girls and started to argue that boys were more intelligent than girls. We found another area where this information was being supported, and that was the scholastic aptitude tests, or SATs. In SAT, boys outperformed girls in mathematical tests, whereas girls were outperforming boys in verbal tests. Now this, it was argued, was because girls in their teenage were more interested in interpersonal relationships than they were in calculating numbers. And that is what gave the girls this advantage in language because language involves human relationships. But this is just a hypothesis. But with time, we found a very, very strange trend. Over the last few decades, we found that girls have started outdoing boys in both verbal and mathematical ability. This is a very astonishing finding. That not only as the difference disappeared where, the boys were outdoing girls in mathematics, girls are actually now outdoing boys in both mathematics and language. What's going on? It's obviously not explainable by genetics. What could go into the making of intelligence? What is this thing that we call intelligence? Intelligence is not just made up of academic performance. Intelligence cannot be discussed in terms of racial differences and cultural differences and gender differences. There's some people who propose that intelligence is normally distributed, just like height or weight in a population. I believe it's an oversimplification. And it is because of this oversimplification that we have these racist and sexist theories of intelligence that actually go against common sense. Intelligence is much more complex than a unitary phenomenon, which is also called the G factor. The G factor theory assumes that intelligence is a very broad general concept and it underlies all human performance. Whereas the S factor or the specific factor theory assumes that human beings are much more complex than that, and that every single thing that we do requires a very different kind of ability, and each of these can be measured separately, and together these can be combined into what we call intelligence. Both G factor and S factor theories emphasize the measurability of intelligence, but they attribute it to different phenomena. The G factor assumes that intelligence is a general phenomena, whereas the S factor theory assumes that it is made up of different kinds of abilities. Some people can have more verbal ability, some people can have better mathematical ability, and so on. In the next lecture, we will discuss this issue in further detail.